predominantly in the East in America. They are elsewhere, but trails like the Appalachian Trail, the Ouachita Trail, and others, there's shelter systems, which are just a network of three-sided wooden structures, lean-to structures that are open to the public to use when you're hiking the trails. And they're spaced out about 5 to 10 miles apart, give or take, all along the way. And they're just open for people to use.
First come, first serve. So the first that come typically serve themselves by setting up their tent, and you don't want to take up too much room as a hiker for the people that are coming later in the day. So make sure you're consolidating your stuff, sticking to one side, sticking to one segment that is just basically body width. Because some of these shelters, on a rainy day are gonna attract a lot of people. So there's two kinds of modes of backpacking and camping and through hiking. It's really just, you have like specific backpacking trips or long through hikes. And on long through hikes, when planning out your campsites, you're really not doing that too often, if at all ever. But when you're planning, say, like a 5-day backpacking trip around Mount Rainier, you have to choose your campsites, in advance. That way, the rangers, have numbers and logistics of where people are, and you're on your permit and all that kind of stuff. So, really, the biggest concern is how many miles per day can you hike? What is your own physical ability for the itinerary you're choosing? Like if your two campsites on days 1 and 2 are 30 miles apart, but you've never done more than 15 miles a day, probably not smart to do for your own physical ability. So you want to gauge your campsite's distance from each other based on your own physical ability.
Yeah, like Tom said, when you're through hiking, I feel like most through hikers, a lot of times on our first hike, we try to plan every single night out, especially people on the Appalachian Trail. It's really common because there's a shelter system. And so people will come up with their 6-month itinerary at like 10 miles a day, and they have all their shelters planned out. And almost always that goes out the window basically as soon as you start hiking. Like even if you do spend all this time planning it out in advance, because things happen along the way. You either go faster than you thought, you go slower than you thought, you get the opportunity to like hang out with a group of people that's hiking on a different itinerary. You go to a trail angel's house, which is somebody that lives near the trail that oftentimes just brings hikers home and lets them stay, or and then you end up staying there for a few days. All kinds of things can happen on a multi-month journey. And even on through hikes, you do, though, have to be mindful because most long distance trails pass through at least one national park that does require permits. And so you have to do permitting, and you will have to be precise with your camping locations there. So that can be actually very difficult for a lot of through hikers, especially if they're trying to plan that before they leave home, because they don't necessarily know exactly when they're getting there. I would say, on the shorter trips, it's a lot easier, like Tom said, to plan where you're going to be. And the resupply is really the biggest thing I think you plan. You rather than where you're camping each night, you're like, it will take me approximately this many days to get to this town. And you plan that out. And then in that section where you camp gets determined by that.
And I think you also want to leave room for error too. I mean, you don't want to paint yourself into a corner where maybe you injure yourself, and then your permitting is such that you can't keep up that pace or whatever. So kind of pull back on what you think your ultimate top line threshold is physically, so you don't overdo it, and then before you know, you're having the worst time ever on this backpacking trip that you've sunk a lot of time, effort, and money into, and probably logistically with other people. Yeah. So you don't want to paint yourself into a corner and have a bad time on a trip that you are hoping to have one of your best times of your life, ideally. So don't overdo it with your itinerary and mileage. If you want to be out there to have a good time, make sure you're going to be able to give yourself that leeway to have that good time.
As a personal trainer, I've spent a lot of time coaching people, and one of the pieces of advice I give them when they are trying to figure out how many miles they can do or their total time, I'm like, what's your time frame for your whole hike? You can do the straightforward division. Okay, I have X number of days to do this distance, and then subtract 1 day per week to have no miles at all. We call it a 0 day.
Yeah.
Because I feel like at a bare minimum, most hikers need at least 1 day off per every 7 of hiking. So that lowers your actual daily mileage because you're not doing your max mileage every day. And that does help you with that buffer, but it can also be more than that. So, but that does help with the planning process.